Wolva, known as Wind Huntress by her late pack, wrapped her arms tightly around her 3 shivering pups, shielding them as best she could. The biting snow swirled around her, the fierce winds cutting through her thick fur. The pups whimpered and trembled in her embrace, causing Wolva to pull them even closer to her grey coat. Desperately, she scanned the area for any sign of a rock outcrop that might offer some shelter from the relentless storm, but the blizzard obscured everything in sight. The clouded sky above her was darkening, and the temperature was dropping drastically. She stumbled over a rock, if only she could find shelter for the night. A cave would be a blessing in this time. Wolva closed her eyes and gave a small prayer to the now hidden light. "Please protect me and my pups," was all she could say before falling to her knees, sinking into the knee-deep snow. The pups, sensing their mother's distress, whimpered and yipped at her. "Don't give up, beloved," the voice of her mate, King Storm, seemed to speak out of the growing darkness. Wolva looked out at the storm, half expecting to see her mate standing there in all his furred glory, tail wagging, but she saw nothing. Struggling to her feet, she held her pups closer, trying to provide them more warmth. The pups pressed themselves against her fur, their yips lessening as they burrowed in closer. She pressed on, doubling her efforts to try and find a place where she could shelter both herself and her pups from the storm. It was as if all the ancestors' blessings had fled. The storm became even stronger, and visibility dropped. The night came on swiftly, and even her wolfish eyesight became useless. She began crying softly, "Please let me find shelter. I'll even accept help from the furless, please." She looked at the sky and howled in anguish. There must have been one ancestor looking out for her, for a voice in her head told her to look to the right. Startled, she did so, and she saw a faint yellow light like the last light of the great light peeking through the clouds on the horizon. The light was visible for a brief moment before it vanished, but it was enough for Wolva to get her bearings. She began trudging toward the light, using what little strength she had left. As she continued, she saw a massive shadow rise up out of the ground. She nearly collided with a stone cliff. Pressing her ear against the stone, she knocked on it. While the noise of the storm muffled her hearing, she did hear an echo from her left. Pressing on, she kept one hand on the wall until she touched something that wasn't stone but felt like fur. She pushed it aside and saw that the fur was covering a cave. Inside, she saw the same yellow light from before. She recognized the light as the one that the furless themselves had tamed, the same light that had destroyed her and her mate's first den. In front of said light, a single figure sat. Wolva saw no claws, meaning this had to be a furless. Her suspicions were confirmed when she saw the furless telltale furs wrapped around its pale skin. She stiffened involuntarily at the sight of her enemy, but she swallowed her pride and slowly approached. She attempted to make some noise so as not to startle the furless, but startled the furless she had, because the moment Wolva entered the small cave, the being turned sharply, grabbed a long stick with a pointed rock at the end of it, and brought it to Wolva's neck, teeth bared in what she assumed was an angry look. She held back her anger. Her pups came first. It was the way of life after all. She slowly lowered the arm that held her pups. They whimpered at being removed from Wolva's warmth. The furless eyes started at the pups and then widened. Wolva spoke, trying to make her desperation heard. "My pups need warmth and shelter from the storm. I implore you, please let us stay." The furless looked at her, then at the pups, then back at her. She tried again, "I beg you, please." She got on her belly and showed it to him, whimpering. A brief bit of pride came up, and she felt insulted that she had to go to such lengths to save her pups, but she swallowed it. The light the furless used provided a warmth that even her body couldn't provide, and she herself needed the light as well. The furless, which Wolva realized was a male, lowered his weapon. He looked at her for a few moments, moving over to the fire. He brought back a small piece of what smelled like roasted meat, placing it down a few steps from her. He backed up and watched Wolva carefully. She snatched it up and chomped into it, letting the juices flow down her face and throat. She was so engrossed in eating that she didn't notice the furless bringing her a small object, which curved up on all sides. Inside, she saw the unmistakable shimmer of water. She slowly pulled the object towards her, careful not to spill the life-giving liquid as she lapped at it thirstily. When she looked up after finishing the water, she saw that the furless had placed a small fur of his own nearby. He was back near the light, facing her and watching her warily. Wolver grabbed the fur and wrapped her pups in it. She attempted to slowly make her way towards the warm light, but the furless stiffened and grabbed his weapon, pointing it at her. She held up the bundle in her hand. "Please, at least let my pups near. They're too small to harm you." The furless glared at the bundle, then back at Wolver. He exhaled in what sounded like an exasperated tone, then put the stick down. He pointed at the opposite side of the light and finally spoke, "You and your young can sleep there, but if you attack me, I will not hesitate." He held up his stick weapon. Wolver slowly approached the light and laid down, unraveling the fur and letting it cover her and her pups. She felt the young begin suckling on her teats, trying to get a meal. She hadn't been able to provide much of her milk lately, and it was too soon for them to eat anything. But with the food she'd just been given, she felt some milk trickle from her breasts. The furless grabbed the object from where she'd left it, filled it with some more water, and then placed it, as well as some more meat, in front of her. She growled at him instinctively, prompting the furless to point his weapon at her. She stopped growling when she smelled the meat. Reaching out, she took it and ate hungrily. "That's all the food I can spare for you," the furless said. "When the great light comes up again, I'll be gone." She looked up at him. "Okay," was all she could say between her swallowing food and water. She pushed the object back to him when she was done. The pups continued to swallow as her teats produced a bit more milk. Finally, after a while, they'd had their fill and curled up next to their mother. Wolver watched the furless warily, despite all that had happened. He was eating a bit of his own meal in a way her kind didn't. He used his hands to lift the meat to his mouth. When he went to drink, he brought a similar object filled with water to his lips and tilted it up, allowing the water to enter his mouth. Furless were a strange people indeed, she mused, as the warmth of the flickering light began lulling her to sleep. To her surprise, the furless spoke again. "Strange seeing one of you alone out here with just your young." Wolver glared at him. "It's none of your business," she growled. To her delight, this caused the furless to flinch. "Don't insult me," he said, grabbing his weapon and pointing it at her. Wolver growled but forced herself to stop as she heard her pups whimpering. "I don't want to talk about it," she replied, holding her pups closer. The furless put his weapon down slowly. "All right." He took another bite, then after swallowing, said, "Where are you going?" "South," she said simply, stroking her pups reassuringly. "I'm heading that way too," the furless said. After he drank some water, he reached behind him and placed a piece of wood on the light, which brightened ever so slightly. Wolver's ears twitched curiously, despite her distrust of the furless. He continued, not looking at her directly, "Our small tribe was trying to reach sanctuary." Wolver nearly gasped. She wanted to reach the legendary land where there was no snow, where the great light was higher and warmer in the sky, and the ground was actually visible. That was where her pack was heading before. She shook her head, cutting off such thoughts. Not knowing exactly why, she replied, "I'm heading there too." The furless looked at her with an odd, curious look in his eyes. He finally spoke. "I think it would be a good idea for us to travel together." Her fur bristled at that. The two looked at each other for a while. Wolver was thinking hard. There was absolutely no way that she could make it over these snowy lands alone, but on the other hand, she wasn't about to trust this furless. Wolver could only guess, but she assumed.